In this, the second lesson of 2 on the Southwest, we are going to be looking at 2 forms of fiber art and then ceramic art. And we're going to start with basketry for fiber art in the Southwest. We left off with fiber art when we talked about Pueblo weaving with cotton in the previous lesson. And now when we're examining basketry, we have to understand that basketry is the oldest utensil producing art in the Americas. Basketry hails back to the days of people spending a lot of time gathering their food. And if you're gathering your food, you need containers in which to gather it, and durable containers for that matter, in which to gather food. Now, basketry itself isn't as popular with the general public, say, in the art world as other arts, such as jewelry, such as weaving, such as ceramics. And even in college classes or in college campuses, I remember when I was in college, there used to be a joke when someone was they would say, it's as easy as taking basketry 101, which was in essence a class where people thought, well, you really didn't have to work at it, and that basketry was something easy to do. We have to understand that that's from a contemporary perspective, because in the days of people who gathered their food, all the way to contemporary time, when you are a basket user, you have an astounding amount of information about your environment, about the different plant materials that you use, the different techniques, and then the wide range of types of baskets that are made for different activities. And at the very base of it, though, they have to be usable. So the baskets themselves being valued for utility first, and then technical excellence and beauty afterward. And we would see this mutate if you take the Native Art History 2 class. You would see how, as a result of contact not only with other tribes in a more prolonged manner, but also the introduction of other types of trade goods from Europe would alter basketry. And then based on the influx of people coming to the Southwest, for example, in the Northwest Coast and California by railroad, it would also promote changes in basketry, as would contact with missions. Would all have different effects on basketry, and then the eventual decline as a result of not only being removed from tribal lands or denied access from places where people traditionally gathered materials for baskets, but you would also have habitat destruction as a result, or you would have the out-and-out death of people who were masters at basketry. So when we're looking at basketry, there is an incredible amount of complex information that's involved in it, and yet the very base tools are a cutting implement and an awl, your hands, fingernails, and teeth. If you have all of those, you're in business, and you can get by without your teeth. It'd be difficult to do without your hands. But these are the very base materials. And then eventually basket making would decline in some tribes. For example, when a tribe becomes more sedentary and they start to switch to doing pottery, ceramics, you would see a decline in basketry making, and they may trade for baskets after that because baskets will still have some functions within certain tribes, even if nothing else to serve food upon, to serve bread upon. They would still be retained, but they may not be made by a tribe for its own use anymore. And it would flourish in other tribes for other reasons. So as you look at that vessel to your right, it is, I like to call it a Navajope, because it was collected in the region between Navajo and Hopi, and it's difficult really to discern who it belonged to, who was the maker of it. But it is a plant fiber basket, and it's covered with pine pitch. Why do you think a basket would be covered with pitch? Think about that for a second. And the pitch itself is a sealer. So there's one hint. It seals the basket. Another hint, that it would be used for carrying water. So obviously, why do you use pitch? To keep the water in. Now this is to show you a little bit more about the science of basketry, because once you start to know the materials, there are other water baskets that don't have pitch on them, but the people who used them knew that when the plant fibers in that basket became wet, they would swell, And once they swelled, they would hold water in the basket. So you could use baskets for carrying water. Now so you would call this kind of an Oya form of basket, and it has handles on it, and it would be carried upon someone's back, but it still has somewhat the form of an Oya, and at the same time combined with a burden basket, such as you saw last week when we were looking at basketry of the ancient Southwest. So basketry is very important in the cosmology as well as the everyday life of people in the Southwest. And we're moving up toward what we would call historic period. And you really know baskets are important when they appear in people's mythologies, in their creation stories and the like, as we would find among the Oldham people, where basketry is an important part of a creation story. We know that it's a very important part in their everyday life. So ancient peoples were making baskets long before they made pots or before they planted corn, because they were gatherers. And once you start planting corn, it means you're moving more sedentary, either horticultural or agricultural. And yet the techniques that were used exist to this day. And when we start to look at different types of baskets, by looking at a basket, you can often discern what its use was. And if it's a hard basket, you know that it would need stiff, heavy warps. Once again, the warp is the foundation of a basket or a textile. And then if it has a very stiff, heavy warp, you know that it's going to be a hard basket, and it's going to be used usually for carrying something or storing something. And whatever that something is, it's going to be heavy. Now, if you used soft, supple wefts, you would also be able to, and wet warps, you would be able to produce basketry mats that would be very pliable, basketry capes, believe it or not, that would be very pliable, as well as basketry bags that would be very pliable, which means that they would kind of bend and shape to the form of the objects or the things that you're carrying in them, or they would be soft enough that they would even mold to the shape of your body. But the techniques that are being used long ago are used to this day. Now, the primary techniques that you would see would be baskets that are either coiled, twined, plated, are the three main that we would see in the Southwest. But what we're going to look at primarily in this lesson is going to be coiled basketry, although this one here would be this tray here, a piki tray, for holding piki bread. It's a Hopi basket, would be what we would call in the plated type of basket. So the skills you would need in a gathering society would be a knowledge of the plant as well as animal movement. You would have a knowledge of the seasons for your homes, because you're looking at a region in the Southwest that would average 44 degrees and a little bit lower in the winter to 100 degrees plus in the summer. It means you also have to be aware of seasonal canyon floods. And then with your material artistic culture beyond basketry, it might not be as important. In this, we also could look at the shape of some homes of people who are primarily basket users. You'd find out if you look at the homes of tribes that go down to a band level. So you have bands, which are collections of families that would congregate into tribes. But at band level and then even at tribal level among some peoples in the Southwest, you would see their homes actually look like overturned baskets. So you carry baskets and you live inside of baskets. And there are also creation stories that ways that people learned how to weave twigs and sticks together were by watching birds and then turning that bird nest upside down and using it one that humans could live within. So these are the types of skills you would need in a typical gathering society when baskets are the primary tool that you would be using for food collecting. So you would need a strong knowledge and training to be a basket weaver, because once again, because you can have a beautiful basket. If it doesn't do the job, all you've got is a beautiful basket and you've wasted a lot of time, people can starve. You'd need a broad understanding of the native materials with which you're working, where they're found, when they're found, how to prep them, whether or not you can put them in your mouth or not, because some materials might be actually hazardous to your health if collected at a certain time of year or if they're not prepped in a certain way. So a lot of the media that you would see in the Southwest would be willow, sumac, mulberry, and other shoots would be used, particularly for the warps, and then various grasses would be used for the wefts. So the shoots would be split into these narrow, flexible splints, and then could be twined for the wefts to be interwoven among them. And so, like a rug weaver, a basket weaver was not only a botanist, but they were an artist, a technician, ecologist, and a merchant. All of this was inherent in basketry in the Southwest, so it goes beyond Basketry 101, and I would suggest that most college students, if they had to survive by making baskets, would die very quickly. I mentioned how it would be primarily coiled baskets that we would be looking at for this lesson. And these three different diagrams illustrate coiling. Now you'll note the basket fibers that are running horizontal to the ground or parallel to the ground. Those would be the warp fibers of a basket. Sometimes warp fibers would be split, which would give the baskets a little bit more pliability, or several fibers would be in essence held together to give better strength to the warp as well as flexibility. And then what appears to be, if you see the plant fibers that appear to be being stitched over, under, and through the warp threads, or warp fibers, then you're looking at the weft fibers of the basket. And there are several different ways of coiling. And you'll note in some of the techniques it involves where you are wrapping your weft fiber around two warps at once, possibly, or one warp, and then as you wrap it around the warp above it, you tuck it underneath the warp of the fiber below it, so that you're eventually pulling all of these fibers together. And different techniques produce different features in baskets. It also allows you, once you start to work with dyeing the plant fibers, it allows you different types of resolution. It allows you the ability to create sometimes very complex designs based on the tightness of the weft and the number of weft fibers that you have per inch. So each of these are coiling techniques, and where you see the warp fibers are running in essence horizontal or parallel to the ground, and then the weft fibers are going somewhat vertical to the warp fibers in order to create the designs as well as the body of the basket. So you have warp being the foundation, weft being the body into which different designs would be created. So this is a coiled basket, and the basket itself would start from the center, and in many ways that we would see the process of constructing a basket from the ground up. You could think of the same thing later on being done with pottery, and instead of using warp fibers, you would use pottery coils to build the basket up on hand-built pots. But you'll note that when you have a coiled basket that it has this distinct look to it, where you can see the warps appearing to run almost in complete circles, or at least one continuous spiral. And in essence, that's what it is. It's one continuous spiral. And then if you look to the almost the middle right of that basket, at the very edge of the basket, you'll see where the last warp has been tied down by the weft. So that's where that spiral terminates, and so you can tell where the basket began, as well as along the rim. You can tell where it has terminated, and then what that kind of finish that you have all around the edge of the basket is called the selvage, S-E-L-V-A-G-E, of the basket, which is the way the basket is finished off, and it is the final touch, the final you might say tying down of the basket, so it stays completely raveled rather than unraveled. And with this basket from about 1680, what else do you know about Pueblo country in 1680? It's an important year. Now in this class we don't go a lot into tribal history. We look more at the arts of tribal peoples within different regions, and if you want to learn much more of the detail about the tribal histories, that's why you would take the indigenous histories classes at various colleges, including the Institute of American Indian Arts. But ways that you would see when we're looking at the lexicon of or the language that's used to describe baskets. This would be called a coiled basket. It would, you might even hear it called a basketry bowl. It would also be called polychrome. Polychrome meaning that it has more than one color, otherwise it's monochrome. Some of the designs might be described as stepped mountain or stepped pyramid designs with cruciform or cross figures as adornment in it, and it gives you an idea of the way that art historians start to describe designs, which may not be necessarily the same way that the individual person who created this basket would have described it on their own. So once again, we're looking at this notion that very often what we study as art history is from the outside looking in, and that we at best can extrapolate from the future to the past on what people were thinking. But we do know, if it's done in 1680, it was in the midst of a very important event in the Southwest. We also know that there may have been some contact with Europeans. So we would have to do a dye analysis on here to see whether it's natural vegetal dyes or whether it was a dye that was traded to Pueblo people, and the same dye might have been used in textiles. So we are looking at the art of high and low plains desert people. High plains and low plains desert. Now this means that there would be relatively small numbers of people compared to other tribes. They would be primarily gatherers who would adopt to farming by about the year 800, anywhere from 400 to 800. Many of these tribal groups share some of the common features of social organization, such as initially being matrilineal and matrilocal. Matrilineal means that your bloodline and your clan goes through the woman. Matrilocal means that when there is a marriage, the family goes and lives near the mother-in-law's house, essentially, near the daughter or the wife's family. There would be extended families who would share hunting, food gathering, and preparation activities. Generally, basketry would be in the purview of women. Hunting would be in the purview of men. And this would be seen as very egalitarian because they would need each other in order to survive. So we're still looking at this level of organization, and these are some of the kind of generalizations we can make. And once again, here's a little bit of an historic irony, because a lot of the basketry that's viewed as very high art in its time period would not, if it had been done in Europe, been viewed as high art, because it would have been made by women, and the job description for fine art to the European mind of the Renaissance was it was precious material, which plant fibers are not, static, standing for something large, you can't use it, it's one of a kind, and made by educated men. Baskets would never fit that, but this shows you once again the 20/20 hindsight and the way that and the certain ironies that the art of women is held in high regard. This includes in the late 1880s when people were collecting baskets made by native women, when a woman from the United States, if she wanted to make a name as an artist, would have to go to Europe in order to do so. So these peoples would have been farming on a permanent basis by around 800. So you'd see this shift also from basketry more towards ceramics, and then trading for baskets with some of the tribes that still made them extensively. And in many ways, this type of climate, this high plains desert, would be inhospitable to the Spanish initially, so it would work in favor of the tribes initially, but that would change. So this Yavapai trade, now we're going to fast forward, about 1880s is the latest of any of the work we'll look at. And this is also a coil basket, and you see radiated stepped designs coming out from the center. And this would have been willow and devil's claw. Devil's claw, in essence, being part of the warp, and then willow being the, devil's claw being the part of the weft, and then the willow being the warp. And trays such as this that we would see among all the people that they describe collectively as the Pai. So it would be Yavapai, Havasupai, Walpai. Right? These are all terms that are used to describe a collection of people who are related through language. So one of the things that we would see, not only relations through language, we would see very distinct similarities in the types of baskets that they were doing. Once again, this is a basketry tray, and it's a coiled design. This Havasupai tray from about 1880 to 1900, willow and devil's claw, and you see what has been called sometimes a sunflower or a sun design, or even sometimes a floral or a petaled flower design. But if you really look at it, it also looks like the 8 petals on it would remind you somewhat of a Zia sign in the Southwest. It would be reminiscent of what would be called a Quaker star in quilting, and you would also see this design at the center appearing in teepees on the northern plains. So we see some very distinct design similarities in the works that people create, and this shows you even more clearly, if you look from the dead center, how this basket is coiled, but also that it is spreading out in a spiral from the dead center as it radiates out further and further. And this is one of the things that's wonderful about basketry, is you start to realize that a person has to be able to think three-dimensionally and two-dimensionally all at once. And on some baskets, and I'm not showing you many from the top down, since this is a tray, you're looking at it from the top down. But what's really amazing with some of the ones that have that more Oya shaped form is that if you were to look at the basket from the top down, you would see an entirely different design geometrically than what you would see as you were looking at it from the side. So this Havasupai tray also might have been used for sorting grain or sifting grain. So this Oya, Western Apache, it's a coiled basket. It's very large. This basket was close to 3 feet tall. And if you were to look at it from the top, this is where I'm talking about how the design would look very different, because what looks like those somewhat diamond shapes that are interconnected as they go down the body that break up the fields of animals, as well as what would be what we might call the 4 winds, whirling logs, or swastika, as it would come out of that area between India and China. That if we were to look at this from the top down, we would get an entirely different design interpretation. But this shows you in a voluptuous form, and the dimensions on it were almost 3 feet tall. The scale of basketry that people would achieve in the Southwest too, and it gives you an idea of some of the design motifs. I very often don't go into dimensions on the works, because I instead try to look more at the visual elements, some of the media elements. You can look up dimensions of baskets. To me, often that's random numbers, unless there's some reason for calling it out to someone's attention. And that's why I mentioned this thing's almost 3 feet tall, so it gives you an idea of the scale of this basket, that it's not something miniature. And this is also what we would see as a part of an interaction once the railroad comes through the Southwest, because some of these really large baskets would start to shrink. Why do you think baskets would shrink? Why do you think ceramics would shrink? Take Art History 212 to find out that answer. A recurring theme that we will experience for the rest of the semester is a description of pre-contact work that was being done in the arts, and then we will introduce also contact period up to historic period. And one of the things that I want to reinforce is that contact with Spain is going to be very drastic, but it's an intercultural contact. And so, for example, when Mexicans come in contact with the Diné or the Navajo, that is an intercultural contact that is just as profound, just as potentially lethal, just as enriching, as when the Dene would come in contact with the Paiute or the Ute or the Mojave, because they are all different cultures. They all have different ways of viewing the world. They all have different language. They all have different survival strategies. They all have different family systems. They all have different spiritual beliefs. So contact with Spain is, we do this as a way of introducing the impact of European technologies too, because one of the things that European technologies also had, that we could say, is being very mobile, which allowed that is from example by the use of the horse, and then later on wagons, and later on railroads, the ability to spread innovations relatively quickly as compared to people who were moving about on foot and then horseback later on. So what we would see almost the horse as a media, not in media that you would use to create something, but media that would be used as part of the transmission of ideas, and as well as their ability to carry lots of things. So when Spain enters the picture, now I'm jumping back into a different type of fiber form again, because the Spanish observed the native peoples in Mexico as well as north of Mexico making a variety of textiles, and records of Spanish observations of weavers in Mexico as well as in what would be called El Norte at the time, and then later on Nuevo Mexico, and as well as Arizona and California, as well as Tejas. They are seeing people who are weaving, and they are weaving with cotton as well as plumage from birds. So making capes out of, for example, turkey feathers, out of macaw feathers. So the feathers may actually be the weft, and then the warp might be cotton or some other type of plant fiber. What the conquistadors brought with them were churro sheep, which have very long wool and lanolin in it that allows the wool to stay very pliable, as well as dang near waterproof. That's what lanolin, it's that kind of grease you have in your hair. By the way, it's a really bad idea to wash your hair every day. That grease that you think is in your hair is grease. It's actually lanolin. Your hair needs that. When you start to take that out, you do things to your hair that in many ways you damage your hair's protective function, because that's what lanolin does too, is it protects your scalp. So enough of the health stuff. All right, back to the art. But when they brought the churro sheep, that they have this long fiber that spins easily and could be mixed with or woven with along with cotton, and it also would hold dye. It also could be, when woven, you could weave a very fine thread with it, a very fine yarn, and it could even be dang near waterproof when woven into some type of textiles. So, and it's also very durable. So the wool that comes up is an important media that's introduced. And then you also see changes in diet as a result of sheep being brought into the Southwest, as well as other domesticated animals. Now, among the Puebloan people, men were the primary weavers when they weren't farming. So that would change after a bit. So when we're looking at weaving in the Southwest, people tend to think of it as women's art among the Navajo, and often make that extrapolation to other tribes. They think that women were the weavers, but actually among the Puebloan people early on, it's the men who were doing the weaving. And we looked at some of the textiles, the styles of textiles in the previous lesson that were being woven. So whether it be sashes, kilts, mantas, shirts, leggings, these were the utilitarian things that the Pueblo were wearing. Now, when the Spanish subjugated the Pueblo, they levied taxes on the people they subjugated. And what this meant then is there became a manta tax, which meant each Pueblos had to produce woven mantas. And this would become very difficult, because it means you're taking time away from your farming in order to weave textiles, in essence, that are extorted from you by the Spaniards. So this creates a lot of tension, a lot of anxiety that would burst into, would be some of the factors that would lead to a revolt at certain times in history. So what happens is that people who are previously wearing everyday attire as well as ceremonial garb and clothing had to start to producing mantas for tribute, and in essence that tribute was to sustain the Spanish missions and garrisons that were being placed among them. So you are paying for being dominated at the same time. And so because the weavers and the Pueblos didn't benefit from this, the tax created some pretty harsh sentiments, some of which would lead to that revolt, the Pueblo revolt that I mentioned, hinted at when I talked about the basket that had been made in 1680, because that's when the Pueblo revolt occurred. So as the Puebloan peoples acclimated to the Spanish presence after the revolt as well as the reconquest, the weaving arts started to diminish as the Pueblos started to move more toward farming and ranching, as well as somewhat mercantile endeavors, and then ceramics would really start to come to the fore. And they were also adapting European style clothing, so that would even more diminish their weaving, because you would start to have clothing mass produced on very quick mechanical looms. And what started to persist in modern time and would be the most viable and the most commonly practiced of all the Pueblo textile traditions, including all the way out to the Hopi, would be embroidery. So it's the type of design that would be embroidered on top of textiles that were already woven. So these are the types of adaptations we see. This movement out of utilitarian and ceremonial garb to an adaptation of European clothing, and then you might say adornment to objects, to textiles, as the form that persists most, while weaving itself of blankets and other types of goods that were everyday would start to be relegated to ceremonial completely, while everyday dress would be manufactured European garb. So a manta, a kilt, and a shawl. A manta is that rectangular blanket that's used as a shoulder blanket or a wraparound dress among Puebloan as well as among the Diné peoples. The borders would often be embroidered, and each Pueblo had favored designs. And this is something we see all the way into Mexico, that different communities were distinguishable by the designs that they had woven into their clothing. So in many ways you could say they had their own dress code. Kilts themselves are wrapped around the waist, and they're not skirts, but they're kilts. So they are a wraparound type of attire. They also had decorated borders. A shawl would be draped over both shoulders, and then breechcloths would be another type of attire where it would be tucked underneath your crotch and then would come up through over the top of a belt in front of you as well as in back of you. And this was the standard type of attire you would have seen in the Southwest in the days before Spanish intrusions. So this example of a man spinning yarn, you'll see a spindle, which is that long stick that comes to a pointed end, and then what's called the whorl, which looks like that disc that's on the spindle. And by attaching whether it be the plant or the animal fiber to the very tip of that stick and spinning it, it causes the different, because you can't see the microfibers without a very strong magnifying glass, because what occurs is the microfibers and the various plant fibers, they catch with each other, and it's almost as if they interlock with each other, and that's what allows you to spin the thread or to spin the yarn. So whether it be vegetal or later on wool, animal based fiber. This example of a Hopi man at a loom, then. It's an upright loom, and as you see here, this is somewhat as a result of the introduction of Spanish-style weaving looms, because some of these tools that you see were actually a direct lifting from the Spanish looms that were used for weaving really large textiles. So where you see your upper bar, you see a ceiling beam. If I'm going from the top down, the ceiling beam is what would hold the permanent upper bar. The upper bar would hold the tension bar, which is used to tension the warps, all right, because you would have a lower a lower tension bar in essence that you would tension the warps around at the very bottom too. You also see then the warps of the textile are running perpendicular, or they're running vertical to the ground, and then the wefts would be woven back and forth. But if you're doing this, you would also need something to hold the various warp threads, every other warp thread, for example, apart from each other, and that is where you would use a heddle as well as a shed rod, and then as well as a batten, which pushes the weft threads down after you've woven them into the warp. So you see, these are actually rather complex set of tools here. That this is an adaptation, once again, of a combination of not only indigenous technology but Spanish technology to create this upright loom, because predecessors to this loom would have been a backstrap loom, for example, that were all over the Americas, and I'll show you an example of a backstrap loom. But this type of loom particularly would have been wonderful for weaving blankets, which is what Hopi as well as Navajo and Pueblo people wove a lot of in the days before Spanish contact. So when you start hearing about Navajo rugs, that's a post-contact phenomenon, and it's generally as a result of drastic economic upheaval as a result of the long walk and the diminishing of Navajo territory, as well as diminishing of Navajo herds. As well as if you devastate an economy, people can't afford to trade blankets with each other, so they start to trade things that outsiders want, such as rugs. So this Zuni blue wool manta, the blue itself would have been an indigo blue, and that was a dye that was brought by Europeans. So this manta here, you see a combination not only of old style aesthetic, but old style, when I'm talking about Zuni, that is aesthetic, with a dye that's coming from Europe, and then to produce this very beautiful manta. This is an example of a backstrap loom, and you'll see that it has some of the same components as the upright loom that you looked at, but in essence the weaver themselves to some degree serves as a tensioning, because you keep the warps taut by having that strap behind you, and you want to make sure that you don't stretch too much, because it will cause your textile to be out of shape. And this type of loom is particularly important when weaving sashes, belts, and head wraps. So that's when you'd see the backstrap loom, and that's one of the oldest types of looms we see all over the world. So this sash here would have been woven on an earlier time on such a loom, and I show this Hopi sash also to show you the embroidery. So you see the polychrome in the greens as well as the reds, and then the very, very dark, and it's a dyed black. It's not a natural black from sheep, but it was actually dyed black. And then this is an example of the type of embroidery that you would see that's now done on the sashes. That if you were to look at sashes that were done by the Anasazi, the designs themselves would have been done as a result of the actual weaving process, and done in white. So whether it be a twill or a type of process that was used, which would give raised designs, such as you saw in the textile from last week from Montezuma's castle. So this embroidery is something that comes with the Europeans, and we will see embroidery as an innovation not only in the Southwest. We will see embroidery in the Northeast. We'll see embroidery in the Great Lakes, as well as in Canada among tribal peoples up there, when Europeans come among them and show them ways to adorn various textiles in such a manner. And this breechcloth also embroidered, and this is once again one of these garments that would be tucked underneath your crotch and then would come up over a belt and hang in front of you as well as behind you. So when we talk about Navajo weaving, this is going to be what people tend to hear more about Navajo weaving than about Pueblo weaving, unless you are someone who is an aficionado for textiles. And we'll go into Navajo weaving in the next subsection of this lecture. Historians and scholars generally divide Navajo weaving into three main early phases, and you might hear it as early classic, classic, and late classic. You might hear it as classic, post-classic, and transitional. You might even hear of it as classic, transitional, and contemporary. There is this artificial dividing of weaving as a way for historians to refer to textiles and trends that were evident at given periods in history. But we also have to understand that when Bessie Manygoats was weaving that blanket, she wasn't thinking, I'm weaving a second phase Ute-style chief's wearing blanket, or when she was weaving that first phase Ute-style chief's wearing blanket that would sell for $500,000 at auction. She wasn't thinking this. She was thinking she's weaving a blanket, someone's going to wear it and be warm and dry. So this once again, this terminology is often applied in hindsight. And it's difficult when teaching an art history class. In the same way when teaching an art history class is you can't possibly cover all in European art. You can't cover all the individual artists. And in this country, while you may not be able to cover all the various artists because a lot of the names aren't known in this particular time period, but you can't possibly do all the tribes. What we try to do is talk about and feature arts of different tribes with the understanding we can't do them all. And then on your own personal interest, giving the tools for critical thinking, you do your own investigation for the tribes that you find particular interest in, using the tools and the lexicon that we develop in this class. So we understand that when we're talking about phase approach, that the dates are only estimates too. They're rough guidelines for discussion and shared meaning for scholars when they talk about various weaving styles that emerged as a result of various cultural and historical and social factors. There are several stories of how weaving came to the Navajo. If you listen to as part of the Navajo creation story, Spider-Woman and Spider-Man teach weaving to First Man and First Woman. Spider-Woman teaches the weaving, Spider-Man teaches how to erect the loom. And it's actually a fun story to look up and listen to the banter back and forth between them. And it almost seems as if every time Spider-Woman says something and then Spider-Man adds something, she corrects him and says, no, this is how it's really going to be done. And it also shows you a little bit about clan, because the Navajo are matrilineal. And so this shows a very strong voice for women among the Navajo in pre-contact era. There's also a story that that refugees, Pueblo refugees, who were male weavers from the Pueblo Revolt, and males and females, they flee during the Reconquest, and they seek shelter among the Navajo. The Pueblo men, who are the weavers, intermarry with Navajo women, and then Navajo women picked it up. And then there's also a story that weaving came as a result of trade and cultural diffusion. And there's also the story that when Navajo women were captured as slaves and they were brought into Mexico, they learned weaving in the various haciendas in Mexico. These are probably all true. They are all ways that weaving came to the Navajo. But once again, we know that something's very important when it appears as part of a creation story in any people. So we see weaving as an important part of the cosmology of the Navajo. Now, the early qualities that we would see then of Navajo weaving, because the earliest example that we know of Navajo weaving comes from a place called Massacre Cave, and it's called Massacre Cave because the Mexicans' army was chasing a group of Navajo who they believed were criminals, and they holed them up in a cave, and then because the Navajo were barricaded into the cave and they had protection, what the Mexicans did is they shot their bullets at the ceiling of the cave, and then the bullets would ricochet down into the cave, and that's how they killed the Navajos there. And there was a fragment of a blanket that was in there. So that's where the earliest example of Navajo weavings, but it's being written about by the 17th century. So the qualities that we would see in Navajo weavings of this day would have been, by the time the sheep were coming to the Navajo, they would have that chorro wool warp and possibly the weft, or they might have a cotton warp with a wool weft, depending on the type of textile. They would have been using cochineal and bayeta,
which was an imported woolen cloth, as the reds, and then indigo blues. So you would have seen primarily reds, blues, and then this natural cream color of the sheep's wool. If there was a black, it actually looked more like a really deep brown. All right, so, and then sometimes the deep brown would be over-dyed black to give it a black appearance. So you would see these either the introduced bayeta, which was the imported woolen cloth, cochineal, which was made from a cactus bug, and they would be ground up, about 100,000 of them, to make a pound of dye, a very rich red that was color fast, a product of the Americas. This red was so important that it was considered plunder on the order of gold when the Spaniards were sacking Mexico. And that's why when you look in Europe, you could tell someone's social class if they were either wearing a really rich purple or a really deep red. And these colors were usually reserved for the really elite as well as church officials. And then the common people wore these drab browns. And so in the Americas, there were already these rich cochineal reds, and the reds themselves were very light resistant too, so they wouldn't fade easily. You would have the introduced bayeta and blues, and then the natural cream color as well as the natural brown color from the sheep. And then you would start to see it with blankets. It's a horizontal design, so they're woven wider than they are tall. And so they were weaving blankets as well as serapes and ponchos that would be worn. And what was wonderful about the blankets too is that because they are of sheep's wool and they would be very rich in lanolin, that even when they got wet they would dry very quickly, or they would resist the moisture very well, unlike cotton, which absorbs water. Wool resists it, so it would dry very quickly. And these were ideal types of textiles to have when you're traveling. So you not only could sit on them, you could sleep on them, and you could put them over your head and make a tent out of them when you were riding in the rain. So the type of loom that you see is very similar to the loom you would have seen among the Zuni, the Hopi, and the Pueblo. Dang near identical. And you see the same parts again, where you have the upper beam, the lower beam, the tensioning beam, the heddle, the selvage, and all of this. So you see that the pieces are dang near identical, but it has a little bit more of a rustic look because imagine it's out somewhere in Canyon de Chelly, hung up on two logs, and this plays into that romantic picture. And I'll be darned, here she is at Canyon de Chelly, sitting at an upright loom. Now, when we're looking at a textile, and this is one of the things we have to understand, is that the textile is the tip of the iceberg of the amount of time that goes into weaving, because you start with the lamb, and you raise the lamb. It's going to have really rich wool, and that's going to depend on the feeding, which means that you're going to be constantly moving back and forth to pastures to make sure the sheep are getting good feed. And then the wool are shorn, and then they're cleaned. It's dyed, mordanted, and then dyed, and then spun into yarn. It's actually a very long process. So here is the tail, not even the tail end, because then you actually have to weave. You have to string up the loom, and then you weave into it. So you're looking at the very tail end of a very long, laborious process when you're looking at textiles. And I want to reinforce again why textiles were valued so much then. Because of the number of labor hours in the days before mechanical looms that went into weaving textiles such as this that the woman is working on at Canyon de Chelly. So another way that we see periods of weaving delineated would be classic, late classic, transitional. So classic period being about 1700 to 1850, it's about 150 years. Late classic being 1850 to 1868, and then transition from 1868 to 1890. Now, something you would see concurrent with 1868 would also be concurrent with the Navajos being moved to Bosque Redondo and then returning back to their home country. And that this means there's a devastation of economy. There's going to be a change in media that's used, but we go more into that in the art history too. And what kind of changes in particular would occur with Navajo weaving. So the overlapping dates between these periods we have this overlap because there aren't distinct stylistic changes that that they stop at 1850 and are no longer weaving classic period. that there's a bit of overlap because people continue to weave certain designs, and we'll see this when we look at some of the textiles that are coming up next. But other important dates that we would see in the Southwest wood weaving would be the introduction of chemical dyes that were coal-based dyes. They're called aniline, and so they're invented in England in 1856, and then they're brought into the Southwest by the railroad by 1865. You would also see these dyed yarns that are brought in from Germantown, Pennsylvania, and they're brought in by the railroad, and these are really, really loud colors, dang near neon colors, and would give rise to what we would call eye dazzler designs, as well as 4-ply dyed Germantown yarn by 1875, which would be a very strong tension yarn because it's in essence got 4 threads that compose the yarn. So it's like the changes that are occurring are a result of economic upheaval, of being removed from homelands, being brought back, and then in the midst of this economic upheaval having new media introduced, such as pre-dyed yarns, until the Navajo replenished their own sheep stock. What would be called a Moki pattern, Moki or the Hopi. So this is a standard style you would have seen Navajos weaving, where the stripes themselves run vertical to the ground or perpendicular to the ground. And this shows a little bit then, because this would be a pattern very commonly used by the Hopi too. So it shows you a bit of a trading of ideas as a result of people living in close proximity to each other, and in this case this particular design in weaving. And then we will look more at what are called the classic chief's blankets in just a moment. I was working in a gallery in downtown Santa Fe. This was a few years back, and one day a man walked into the gallery, and he was carrying a garage bag. He had been at a flea market in Arkansas, and he looked on the floor, and there was a man's old hound, and laying on the hound was laying on a blanket. And so he looked at the man and he said, "How much do you want for your dog's blanket?" And the man said, $25. And so he bought the blanket, and he brought it to Santa Fe, and he showed it to the man that I worked with, and it was one of these. It had a little bit of damage in it. After it was restored, it sold for close to $300,000. Once again reinforcing the notion that at the time this blanket was woven, no one was thinking nearly $250,000. They were looking in terms of utility as well as symmetry and beauty. But this would even change across culture, because if you remember when we were looking at the first North American module, at the very top there's an image of a Piegan man, and he's wearing this style of blanket. Now, how did that blanket get there, and how much did it cost by the time it got there? Because this was a very highly desired trade item. From the time that it left the loom of this weaver and made its way to the northern plains, the price had probably escalated 7 to 8 times what was originally paid for it. And it being a very highly valued item, that one of the ways that you could, as a man up there, a way you could show your high standing and your wealth was to have your wives all adorned in this style of blanket. And there are several famous chiefs. There are photographs of them with their wives, each of them with their equivalent of the Porsche of textiles, the first phase chief's Ute style wearing blanket. Now, you'll note with this blanket, as compared to the other blankets, that the Moki that I just showed you, that the stripes are running horizontal to the ground. So this is a design consideration. They're running parallel to the ground. You would wrap this around you, and then as it was wrapped around you, the stripes ideally would match up to, it would almost make you look like a barber, or not a barber's pole, but like a tube with all of these stripes directly connecting with each other, so it would create a solid stripe around you when it had that type of symmetry. Now this is with an indigo blue, a very dark natural brown, and once again this cream color sheep's wool. And so what we call a first phase, what is typical of the first phase, is just these blankets that are woven wide and then the stripes are running parallel to the ground. They are single stripes, and generally with these three colors: the natural cream, the natural brown, and the indigo blue. And when you look at this indigo blue from this time period, it really makes your eyes happy. It's a very, very luminescent blue. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing to see. And so I felt fortunate to even have looked at this blanket that was brought into the gallery very close up. But I also remembered thinking about the inherent irony of someone having their dog laying on it, someone recognizing it as something very important, and then being also peeved when they wanted to get $400,000 and they only got $325,000. I thought, oh my gosh, that's very strange. And that's in many ways the contemporary art world. What punctuates a second Chief's blanket, you see it's still woven wide, you still see stripes, but then you start to see either the introduction of rectangles or these very small repeating rectangles, dead center of the blanket, as well as each of the edges. Now what would happen then when you wrap this blanket around you, those red rectangles that you see, and now we see this introduction of either the bayeta or the cochineal red along with the indigo blue and the natural cream and brown color, is that when you wrap this blanket around you, those small red stripes would match up with each other and then complete the field. And so this is another part of that aesthetic. So you see something in two-dimensional, but you also envision how it would be three-dimensionally. So typically a second phase blanket is one where you see either the introduction of rectangles or squares into these solid stripes, and also the introduction of the color red. Once again, when some Navajo woman decided to weave in this manner, she wasn't saying, I'm going to change out of first phase into second phase, and this will only sell for about $100,000 in a pristine condition. They weren't thinking any of this. They were just thinking, I wonder what this stripe would look like if I put red in it. All right, this is the type of thinking that's going on. All right, they're not seeing things at this macro art world level. They're seeing things very much at the individual, then family, then clan, and then tribal, and then trade level, but not so much the large art world as it would be appreciated from 190 years later or so. What punctuates third phase from about 1860 to 1880 would be then the introduction of diamonds as well as diamond sections. So you see a strong central diamond, dead center of the stripe on this textile. So it's woven once again wider than it is long because it's worn as a blanket wrapped about your shoulders. That diamond then is cut in half, and you see half of it put above and then half of it put below. So if you were to fold that blanket vertically, those two halves above and below that central single diamond would match up to create a whole diamond. Or you can see how the diamond has been quartered on the sides as well as halved. So if that blanket's wrapped around someone, at the very lower part of that blanket, when those two quarter diamonds are put together at the bottom, when that blanket's wrapped around you, they form that half a diamond that's dead center that would be worn along the spine. The same thing is at the top. So we see still the indigo blue, the natural colored brown as well as cream color, and then either your bayeta or your cochineal red with the stripes, but the introduction of diamonds and then diamond sections as part of the overall field. These are the typical Chiefs phases. There's the first, second, and third phase. Now they will also call them revival, where the diamonds and the quarter diamonds and half diamonds would be revived later on. They would also might be considered part of transitional, depending on what time period in which they are being woven. And then, if there is no other name but for these types of where you see a combination of what we would call Mochi style, where you see the stripes now are running back to being vertical to the ground, and then you see those diamonds as well as serrate diamonds, where you see those almost sawtooth edges around the diamond. Those would be called serrate diamonds, as well as serrate half and quarter diamonds that refer to the edges in the white, the blue, and the red. This, if it's done in the 1870s, is still considered classic period. It's a serape worn like a blanket, and but you'll see it has the design elements not only of the mokis, but design elements that you would see in this case that would appear in the third phase Ute style chiefs wearing blankets. I think it's a lot to say. So you start to understand why the lexicon is often more for the historians than the individuals who actually wove these textiles. And then also showing you the type of manta, the two-piece dress that the Navajo were weaving and wearing up into the 1880s, still do so for ceremonial use, but not as much for everyday use. And because by this time period also the Navajo are transitioning into Western style garb, and weaving itself is starting to go somewhat on the decline as a direct result of the decimation of sheep herds. And it wouldn't be until the sheep herds would recover that you would start to see a lot of the explosive creativity in Navajo weaving starting to reemerge. So we've talked about fiber arts of the Pueblo with cotton. We've talked about fiber arts related to basketry among the Hopi as well as the Pai peoples, and then fiber arts with the Navajo. We're now going to be talking about ceramics in just a moment, but only going up to historic period. We won't be going so much into necessarily the regional types of ceramics that we see with the different pueblos, because the different pueblos all have their own distinctive manners of creating ceramic vessels, as well as distinctive design patterns. But once again, because we can't cover them all, we just give you the tools to start to interpret and investigate other types of ceramics you would see created by other Puebloan people in the Southwest. We're now going to examine historic period ceramics with a particular focus on the Hopi as well as Zuni work. And in many art history classes, you often won't look at an image such as this, which is an incomplete vessel. This from probably around the year 16 to 1700. And why I like to start with an image like this is to show, for one, ceramics as being a long-standing activity in the Southwest once people became more sedentary. Also that ceramics were being decorated long before they were being traded to Europeans and sold at auction for astounding prices. This is long before different Pueblo potters such as Nampeo of Hano or Maria Martinez and the people who follow them would have international renown based on their talent in ceramics. That it is a long-standing cultural art form, a tradition, but also one that has utility. Once again, it can be very beautiful. If you can't use it, you've wasted a lot of time creating something that no one can use and doesn't help you feed your family. So when part of the aesthetic that we're looking at beyond what we see at Sotheby's and Butterfields and other auction houses today, where you're looking at things that people hold in high regard as art, we're also going to look at the so-called mundane and the total process of ceramics, and as well as ceramics as a focal point for exchange of ideas. So this Sikyaki jar from about the year 1400, so it would have been before the Spanish intrusion into the Southwest. You'll note some of the design elements are very similar to what you would see among the ancestral Pueblo people, and there are also design elements that you would find on contemporary Hopi pottery. Some of these design elements would also appear in textiles. They would appear in kiva murals. And in some ways I often thought of ceramics as three-dimensional kivas, that they have the same shape in that they're circular, and that you are painting onto a two-dimensional surface with polychrome paint, various personal as well as important spiritual ideas. So we'll see that, for example, one of the ways that you can distinguish Hopi pottery is by its palette, but it's not a tried and proven, because different pigments as well as different slips, and even clays were traded from tribes to each other. So this reconstructed vessel it shows us the extent of this long-standing ceramic tradition. If we are to fast forward about 300 years, a vessel of similar form and a similar design field. If we look at the vessel just before, you see that you have a strong top pattern and then a banding pattern around the middle, or the girdle of the same to girdle the vessel, and then there would be a pattern underneath very often. So you'd see the field broken into at least 3 or 4. And if we were to compare that to this one, that there are still distinct patterns that go around the banded pattern that goes around the mouth or the lip of the vessel. You then have the design pattern that is the polychrome that you see broken up by a line, and then the field of the ceramic vessel that's below what we can see with the eyes here based on the angle at which this image was shot. But we see very often in some of the pueblos this tendency to break the vessel up into 3 distinct, you might say, canvases, sometimes 4 different canvases, each of which would have certain styles of designs placed within them, certain design expectations, certain stylistic conventions that would be part of the tribe's overall view of the way that a vessel would be painted, and then expressions of those ideas that are done by the individual, which may deviate slightly. But those aren't the only types of vessels that were being created. That when you look at these oyas, you see one from about the year 1500 at the left, and then from about the year 1800 or so on the right. And these are what they would call corrugated vessels, and they have important considerations. Now, when you see the pinched design on the right, it's just an elaboration upon the design that you see at the left. So you can see that it was still corrugated, and then the person decided to incise those hatch marks, as you see around the middle part of the vessel. You still see the vessel broken up into now 4 sections, because you have the pinched corrugated at the top, you have the design band, the pinched corrugated just underneath the design band. This is on the right, and then it's not empty, it's just not adorned in the same way, the very bottom of that vase. And then when you look at the vessel on the right, it's broken into the lip as well as the corrugation, and then the smooth surface at the bottom. These both served important functions in cooking. That this type of vessel, when you have this kind of corrugation, gives more mass to the vessel, which means that it's going to collect heat and retain heat longer. So it allows you to keep things hotter as a result of it. You can cook in it, for that matter. So those coils, if you've ever seen heating coils on a stove, these serve somewhat the same function, although the heating coils on a stove are electrically charged. What would happen here is that the heated liquid itself, the heat would become stored in those corrugations and then would release slowly. So you could store more heat because you have more mass in the vessel itself. So it has a pragmatic as well as an aesthetic function too. What we would call redware, based on this red appearance, that we also see this tendency to break the design field up into at least 3 sections. So you have the section around the lip, and then the middle section, and then below the middle section. Now, when you have a lot of red, it also lets you know that there's a lot of ferrous oxide in the pigment that's being used as the glaze, and this is a glazed vessel. Now, the reason it's called Rio Grande is that you see similar patterns and similar vessels found all along the Rio Grande River, so it's very difficult to tell where, without breaking the pot, where this pot came from, because you can do ceramic analysis and actually tell where the clay came from sometimes. But if you introduce foreign temper to it, then that changes it. A temper is a ground up matter that's introduced to the clay while it's wet to give the clay body as well as to assist in the firing. Because the temper itself acts like little heating elements within the clay too. So the pot process and building one up is you would gather the clay from the family spots, you would clean it and then pulverize it, you would mix it with the temper, which I just described, and the temper could be old pots that have been ground up, the temper could be sand, it could be mica. For example, micaceous clay has the temper built right into it, or it could be ground up seashells. For example, these would all be added to the clay in order to give the clay substance, strength, but also to assist in the firing of it. The clay would then be coiled and then placed on a plate or a puki, and then you would thin as well as scrape the walls. You would cover the vessel with a slip. You would then polish it with a smooth stone or a rag or a piece of gourd, and then you would fire it on a windless day. Some of the vessels would be painted after they were fired too. So you might glaze it before, or you may paint it afterward. It depended on the technique. So what you see to the very left here is a piece of gourd that was used for smoothing a pot. You actually see the puki, which is the form upon which the pot would be built up, and you'll see that puki has a nipple on it, and that tells you that this pot is that if you've ever looked at the bottom of a pot and it seems to have that nipple, this is the type of form that it's sat upon. And what that also allows, the pot, it can stand up on its own, but it also allows you to fit it on top of your head if you're going to be carrying things. And then you see a polishing stone to the lower right. So this is some of the basic tool case in building up a pot, and then the pots would be painted with a yucca fiber as a paintbrush, and then various glazes or paints that would be applied either before or after the firing. So if you're looking at a pot like this, this is very often what you won't see as considered part of art, but what I like to show about this is that voluptuous manner of this Oya. And the reason that it can stand on its own is because it sat on that puki form. And you still see within it its own sense of design symmetry before the slip was applied or before any of the design was applied. And so while it may not have the same type of look as these finely finished pots that we look at, if we were to look at it in terms of its symmetry and its overall form, we can appreciate the inherent beauty even before the adornment. And once again, in art history, things often get privileged by historians. So some objects stand out more than others because they've been privileged by historians to be given that station. And I prefer to privilege the mundane just as much as the beautifully adorned, because even in the shapes themselves we can gain some sense of visual pleasure. So characteristic of Hopi pottery is a lot of the clay doesn't need temper. It already has its own tensile strength to it. You would find often storage jars and bowls being the most common. You would often see a cream slip with a monochrome and polychrome designs applied to them, such as we saw in the earlier Sityaki pottery from the 1400s, and the 1500s, and then the 1700s. But by the 19th century, pottery making was on the decline. What do you think led to the decline of pottery making among the Puebloan people? Think about that for a second, and if you thought the introduction of metal kettles, you're dead on. Metal doesn't break as easily, and it also holds heat considerably longer. You can boil things easier. You can suspend them over fires without fear of them cracking for longer periods of time. Although at the turn of the century, with the introduction of the railroad, and people wanting souvenirs and other relics from the Southwest to bring back home with them, you saw the revitalization of pottery making. But to find more about that revitalization, you would have to take the Art History 212. So this is the type of vessel that most people would be familiar with at this turn of the century period. And this shows you the white slip. This is a dish, and then the polychrome painted designs on them. And as we look at these vessels, they were collected among the Hopi, and this is where we start to see, now because they were collected among the Hopi, does it mean that they were made by the Hopi? And so in the last part of this lecture section, for this second part lesson on the Southwest, we'll look at this idea of the intertribal, intercultural possible exchange either of ideas or of the wares themselves. So take these two designs in visually. You see two ceramic Oyas. You see them with primarily a white slip and then painted polychrome designs. You see the necks of the vessels broken, not literally broken, but you see that there's a distinction between the design that's painted separate and distinct from the neck to what we see around the voluptuous part of the body as compared to the bottom of the vessel. You'll also note, not only is it painted in polychrome, that if you look to the upper left vessel, you'll see a medallion that looks almost like a cross that's leaning on its side at the center of the vessel. And then to either side, if you look to the left, you'll see a circle that appears to have, it's almost like a sun design, and then residing within that sun design, you see a roadrunner as well as a parrot. And the roadrunner and parrot, this is a wonderful combination of birds, because you have the parrot feathers coming out of the south. And so you see this as one transcultural connection, and then the roadrunner itself as being indigenous to the area. And then if you look to the lower right, you see a vessel that has a parrot over on the right hand side of the vessel, and you'll see it's a very pronounced beak there. And then you'll see that there is a floral medallion, that circle, that black circle with a floral pattern inside of it, and then flowers appear to be hanging over that medallion. But you also see it broken up into three fields: a distinctive pattern at the lip of the vessel, a distinctive pattern around the body, and then a solid kind of a redware color at the bottom, a rust red. But what's amazing with this, with either of these vessels, is that you find design elements from what would appear among other pueblos in the Southwest. But it's collected at Hopi. Now this is why I want to pose this question, because it's collected at Hopi. Was it made at Hopi, or was it traded there? But because all we know is where it was collected, there's no information about the person who made it. We can only guess whether it was a Hopi-made vessel or whether it was made further to the south and to the east, such as among the Zuni. Now you'll note this Zuni vessel is broken up into three fields. You have a distinct pattern that runs around the rim, and then you have a delineated pattern that runs around the body, and then a redware, solid red color at the bottom. And you'll note there's a medallion there, that circle with a floral type design in, and then the abstract geometric motifs. Learn that word, abstract geometric motifs, and then the hatch marks and polychrome, but you see it's on a white background. Now one of the main differences that we see between this vessel and the previous ones is that the previous ones tend to hint more toward redware, even in the slip around it. And we do see Hopi redware as part of the slip that do not appear as much so among the Zuni. So this would be one of the things that if we see that appearance of it hinting toward orange or redware, we might think, okay, maybe it's of Hopi manufacture. But this is some of the detective process that you might go through if you are working in a museum or working in a gallery, or if you're out in some flea market and you see something like this, and you start to be able to distinguish based on stylistic features, at least narrow, and possible solutions of the origin of different works that may be that we can't attribute the ownership. Now generally in museums, if they can't attribute which tribe made it, they won't put it out. It will stay, even if it's really beautiful, it would stay back in the storage area, because people don't like to see something untitled unless it's done by a modern artist or untribal. Now Zuni pottery, another thing that we would start to see then is that if it's of Zuni manufacture, then the clay is going to be heavier. It means the walls are going to be more dense, and they may seem somewhat more irregular. That you would still see a white slip that browns with age, but it doesn't go toward that red like we see in the Hopi ware. You would see polychrome designs, and primarily in a brownish black and red. You'd have a base that would often be the reddish or brownish color, and then this rhythm of repetition and design elements. So another thing that we might look at when we're comparing the vessels that you looked at previously is the thickness of the walls as compared to the thickness of Zuni walls. And the more and more you would look at the ones that I showed you first, you would think, it's probably made by the Hopi based on the thickness of the walls. But wait a minute, it has design elements that we might think that we would find among the Zuni. So who was doing them first? I don't know. But we see that often the neck and the body in Zuni ware also has two different designs. The neck will have simple repeating motifs, which have those fine line as well as abstract geometric motifs. And then the body will often have things like the deer or deer motifs, and then the fine line, the stepped designs, as well as rosette motifs, and sometimes other animals such as birds appearing in it. And then sometimes within the deer designs, you'll often see what's called the heart line. This becomes such a stereotype with Kitch in the Southwest too, that stands for that being's life energy. So an Oya that would have been made about 1830, where you're looking at stepped designs. So you would look at this as an inverted stepped pyramid design with a serrate pyramid design at the center. You would also see an inverted and then right side up what might be called butterfly designs rendered in an abstract manner. As you see, those triangles are actually, you can see the, I don't know if it's called a hibiscus or a proboscis of the butterflies, but you see the butterfly patterns alternating between the inverted stepped pyramid that reaches all the way around the vessel. But you'll note that the abstract designs that go around the neck are different than the abstract as well as anamorphic designs, or entomorphic, like an insect-shaped designs around the side, and then that reddish ware bottom. But you'll notice the vessel walls have a very thick consistency, a very thick and design to give the vessel itself more stability as compared to the ones we saw found at Hopi. So was it a Hopi potter in the earlier designs that who was using or was inspired by as a result of trade, because the tribes did trade with each other in plumage, in stones, in lapidary, and in ceramics, or at least in ideas. But it's very difficult to say where the designs resided first. So this is still evidence of intercultural exchange, either in the vessel itself or in design motifs from various tribes in the Southwest based on their close proximity to each other and as a result of them being trading partners at various times throughout history. Something else that we see in Zuni ware are the relief designs that appear. So the vessel on the left has a relief toad. So it's a polychrome vessel. It's polychrome on a white painted slip. You'll note the vessel itself still has thick walls though. And then the toad in raised relief. And then to the vessel on the right, you see not only the raised horned toad, because you can see all the bumps on the toad's back, but you also see a parrot there as far as alternating horned toads and parrots on this white painted slip, and then polychrome abstract geometric motifs with raised ceramic horned toad intermittent with parrots. I mean, you start to see if you were to start to describe these at auction, the different types of terminologies that people would use. Much the same way, if you looked at the left vessel again, you would be calling that painted figure an abstractly painted butterfly design. So these are different ways that art historians start to be able to establish a common lexicon to discuss works once the makers have passed and you don't have those individuals to speak with. Many of these examples that I'm showing you, by the way, part of the American Museum of Natural History collection that I asked you to look at and to become familiar with earlier in the semester, so that when I refer to some of these works, you can actually go back and find them in the collections and read a little bit more of the detail that was collected with them. Now, the reason I want you to go and find these vessels in the collection is you'll find out that the information that was collected on them was where it was found, the year it was collected, sometimes how much was paid for it, if at all. And that's going to be it. So in other words, it's an anonymous maker, and that reinforces what was discussed in an earlier lesson about not much being known about the artists who were creating these works, particularly during this time period of museum collecting. And then the pattern that is often called a deer in the house is part of a belief in making ceramics. Now, someone might think, I want a picture of a deer in my house, and so you'd have a deer, and then you would see that type of a dome shape over that deer called the deer in the house.
And it's kind of like, I guess, maybe the way that Christians would want a picture of Jesus in their house, that you would want a picture of a deer in your house as it's depicted on a ceramic vessel. And then you have that heart line that will run from the mouth to the stomach in the deer. Or you'll often see birds that are often squat with flowing plumage, as I showed you in that previous vessel. And they would also be inside the so-called house design. And so an example of a deer in the house. Here you see the deer as it's depicted inside of that dome structure, and then you see the deer's heart line, and then the deer is interspersed with this medallion, a polychrome floral medallion. That's what it would be called. And if you look at that medallion, you'd also see something very similar to a jewelry design that appeared with the Spanish. If you've looked at concha belts, that many early Spanish saddles actually had the same type of design that would be part of the saddle adornment. And some of the Spanish saddle designs came from the Arabs. And the Arabs, having invented the saddle that the Spaniards were using, and some of the gear that Spaniards were using, that made their way to Mexico as a result of the conquistadors, and then they made their way up into Nuevo Mexico as well as Arizona and California. And this design pattern may not have been one that was indigenous to the area, but may have been brought as a result of contact with traders, or for that matter conquistadors, and then made its way as an expression, as a medallion, intermittently on this Zuni vessel. So we can but wonder about the number of intercultural influences when we look at ceramics as a result of this exchange of ideas from people of different cultures. And in this case, it would be not only the Spaniards to the Hopis to the Zunis, but the Zunis to the Hopis to the Spaniards, as well as other Puebloan and other tribal groups in the Southwest. So through this, we establish many concepts that will be reinforced throughout the semester, and the resulting changes that occur as a result of intercultural contact. So we have not only the initial stylistic conventions, the manners in which tribes and individuals portrayed their aesthetic on various things that they made, but then how individuals expressed it through their own style. And then what occurs when there's contact with people from not only other tribes, but from other parts of the world. What are ways that we start to infuse new ideas in the things that we create, all toward the attainment of things that are visually pleasing based on our own tribal or national sense of aesthetic. And with this then we conclude the second of two lessons on Arts of the Southwest, reinforcing the idea once again that we talk about only a few tribal groups and then establish some of the concepts that we will use throughout the semester as we cover only a few tribal groups, with the intent that based on the conceptual framework and the critical framework that you develop by going through these lessons, you can then apply it as you look at the tribes that are of particular interest to you.